Good afternoon, Canada. Welcome to another True North Report. My name is Andrew Lawton, fellow with True North, here for another update. I didn't actually get the chance to go live last week because I was down with a cold and I could barely talk for 5 minutes, let alone 35 minutes. So I still have a bit of a cold now. So I'm just going to give you fair warning that if I start like hacking up a lung in the middle of it, it's not that the government has tried to silence me. It may well be that the government has tried to silence me, but I'm prepared to, at least this week, if I suddenly lose the ability to speak, to blame it on the lingering effects of a cold that, as I talk about it right now, I might need to cough. So in any case, thank you very much for, in advance, your patience. Wanting to talk about a big issue that has actually come to a bit of a climax in the past week with different stories that ultimately are all part of the same story broadly, which is Justin Trudeau's assault on Canadian gun ownership and by extension on Canadian gun owners. And this is a big issue. It's not just Justin Trudeau, it's Justin Trudeau, Ralph Goodale, Bill Blair, this chimera of sorts, this three-headed monster that is hell-bent on eliminating gun ownership rights in Canada. And the reason I say that with a bit of trepidation is because in Canada, we don't really have the right to gun ownership at all. And this is something that when I say gun ownership in Canada is a privilege and not a right, I'm not ceding left-wing logic here. I'm actually acknowledging the law as it stands right now. Everyone in Canada is legally barred from owning firearms unless you have a permit saying otherwise, a possession an acquisition license or a restricted possession and acquisition license. Now, I have one of those, millions of other Canadians do, but the fact is that that license is a permit to break the law, essentially. It's a permit to do what otherwise the law says you can't, which is own, transport, possess a firearm. And the reason this is so important is because that status quo means that if you were to eliminate all gun laws in Canada, guns would be banned. If you were to eliminate all of the regulations, rather, that exist around gun ownership, I should be more precise in my language there, gun ownership would be banned. So as it stands, the Conservatives have succeeded in putting, when Harper was in power, a few different steps in that eased gun ownership. It didn't break down the bulk of gun control, but it broke down some of the things that were really needless impediments to what gun owners are doing with their firearms without issue on a regular basis. And the big thing that happened here is the Liberals completely fear-mongered on it. When Justin Trudeau was standing up and fighting back against some of the Harper-era reforms, he was blatantly lying, or alternatively had no idea what he was talking about when it came to the gun laws in Canada. For example, one of the changes that Harper put into effect was taking this paper authorization to transport that you need to bring your gun from home to a gun range and back, and saying, we're going to take this ATT, as it's called, and make it a part of the license. Instead of being a separate piece of paper, it'll be a part of your firearms license because the eligibility criteria are the same. Justin Trudeau said that would mean that anyone could just take a gun and go and shoot up a mall without issue. Didn't actually need to be true for him to say that and fearmonger about guns. And the problem with firearms laws in Canada is that they're only really understood by people who own firearms in Canada. So when the Liberals say something about gun ownership, it's a minority of people in Canada that know that is not true or know that that's misrepresenting the truth, which makes it very difficult to have an honest discussion about it because the vast majority of people in this country are not gun owners and as such do not understand what it is that's being legislated and what it is that's being discussed. And this is why it makes it such an important issue, because when I say minority rights, I'm not talking about the identity politics minority rights we hear about from the Liberals, but the rights that are afforded to a group that is statistically a minority. And gun owners in Canada are a statistical minority. I'm not making a judgment call. I'm not talking about this whole diversity as our strength nonsense. So gun owners are a minority. So anything that is about the rights of gun owners or the privileges afforded to gun owners is by its nature dealing with a minority of the population in Canada, which is why the gun lobby needs to be loud. It's why the gun lobby needs to speak up, and it's why the gun lobby needs to be heard, even if the Liberals are hell-bent on eroding the remaining privileges and rights that have been given to gun owners. And again, I say this, I'm completely biased in this. I am a gun owner, so I have skin in the game on these issues about which I'm speaking right now. But I want to go over a couple of the big changes, because the reason this is so important is because C-71, which is the massive gun reform bill that the Liberals just passed into law last week, was supposed to be the Liberals' answer to the Harper easement of gun laws. That was what C-71 was supposed to be. It was supposed to be about all the things the Liberals were going to do to roll back gun rights. And it was this sweeping, massive bill that was put into effect about a year and 2 months ago. Or sorry, introduced into Parliament a year and 2 months ago. Now, just this past week, C-71 passed in the Senate. And the Senate was really where gun advocates were focusing all their efforts, because the Senate, where the chamber that we're told this sober second thought takes place, Canadian gun owners hoped would be the place that you could put some common sense into this. But what ended up happening, and perhaps unsurprising, is the independent senators group, which is basically the group of senators who were all appointed by Liberals but call themselves independent, all voted as a bloc to pass C-71, not just to pass the government gun reform bill, but to pass it and to kibosh amendments put forward by Conservative Senator Don Plett. So they basically rolled back any of the little things that were done to try to improve it and make it more effective, meaning the independent senators proved that they are not independent at all, but they're entirely dependent on Liberal rationale and Liberal vote whipping. But I want to go over what some of the changes were that were in C-71, because I want to stress here that this is not a bill that does anything to improve public safety. Despite what the gun control activists are saying, that this is a long overdue bill and it doesn't go far enough, but it's a good step, it actually doesn't do anything as far as public safety is concerned, nor does it do anything to keep guns out of the hands of people that shouldn't have them. So one of the big things that I really take issue with, when you apply for a possession and acquisition license in Canada, or a restricted possession and acquisition license, you have to go through a background check. You also have to go through a questionnaire that asks you about things like bankruptcy, job loss, divorce, and mental health history. And specifically, it looks at a relevant period of within the last 5 years on most of those things. Not all, but on most of them, it's looking at your life in the last 5 years. For example, I've been very open in Canada in my life. I've dealt with mental health issues. When I applied for my gun license, it was within the last 5 years that I had had those issues. So I had to be transparent about it and go to police and say, yes, this is what happened. Here's a letter of explanation. Now, in my case, it didn't disqualify me from having a gun license. What it meant is that they did extra scrutiny. They wanted to interview family members of mine. They wanted to do their due diligence. And I'd say the process worked. The process worked because the police and the chief firearms office made an adjudication of my situation and said, yes, he's not a menace to Canadian society. Hold your jokes back. So now what they're doing is they're succeeding in actually making it so that instead of looking at the last 5 years of your life, the background check and this scrutiny will go to the entirety of your life. Now, I want to make a point here about why this matters. If you're a 65-year-old who's applying for a gun license, your life when you were 18, when you were 22, is now going to be part of it. So we're looking at screening that will now go back 40 plus years. 40 plus years. And we're not just talking about, if you had a violent murder conviction 40 years ago. We're talking about things in your life, personal details in your life that have no bearing whatsoever on where you are now and on firearms ownership now. And all of a sudden, we've given the government license to take that all into consideration here. Now, this doesn't mean that things that come up will be automatic disqualifiers, but it means that now government databases have much more of your information at hand. And more importantly, there are many more criteria that can be used to go after gun ownership. And again, we go back to the fundamental axiom here, which is that the law does not view gun ownership as a right. Therefore, you do not have a right to complain about all of this. You can't say, well, hang on, this violates my rights because you don't have any. When you are asking for a gun or license to own a gun in Canada, you are already saying to the government, I'm surrendering my rights. And one of the key examples of this is that the chief firearms office or local police departments can right now, without a warrant, come into my home and do an inspection to make sure that I'm following the storage laws. That's one of the things you agree to by owning guns in Canada. Another example, the chief firearms office is doing daily background checks to make sure that my situation in the eyes of the law has not changed. This is not something that is done on regular non-gun owning citizens in Canada, but when you are a gun owner, this is all part and parcel of what the state can do because you've signed these rights away. Now, I want to make something very clear here. I'm not doing this to say, oh, woe is me, gun owners are so hard done by. What I'm doing is stressing how stringent and strict the regulations already are about gun ownership to illustrate why it's so ridiculous to put more barriers and more impediments and more obstacles for these people, knowing that they're not the ones causing the problems. Toronto last year had a record-breaking year for gun homicide. It outpaced what happened in 2008, which was called the Year of the Gun. The culprits of these were not the people like me that are subject to warrantless searches, that have had the vetting by the RCMP, that have the daily background checks. We are not the problem. Excuse me. That's what I was talking about at the beginning. Apologize. I know it sounds terrible. So this is one of the big things that C-71 does. Your entire life history is now subject to scrutiny when you're applying for a license beyond the 5 years. Now remember, I have not heard of a single case in Canada, and I'm saying this point blank, I have not heard of a single case in Canada where someone's history who was a law-abiding gun owner prior to 5 years would have prevented something from happening. I've not known of anyone where a law-abiding gun owner was given a gun license, but if the permit period that was under scrutiny had been extended to 7 years, 10 years, 20 years, they wouldn't have been granted one, making this an effort that only seeks to detract from rights rather than enhance public safety. One of the other issues is the reversal of the authorization of transport restrictions that Stephen Harper eased, meaning the automatic ATT, the thing that says if you have a restricted gun, it's licensed, it's registered, you can just with your license alone drive to the gunsmith or to the gun range or wherever the case may be. The Liberals are changing that. So if I have, let's say, a mechanical issue with my firearm and I need to take it to the gunsmith, I need to go to the government to effectively get permission for it. I need a piece of paper that says, you are hereby authorized. We've given you permission to do this. But now again, you're talking about bureaucracy, which comes with a price tag to do something that I am lawfully entitled to do. When again, there has never been a mass murder or a homicide in Canada that used a firearm where a criminal has used an ATT. It's a piece of paper. If I want to take my gun, go somewhere and commit a crime, I'm not going to log my flight plan, if you will, with the RCMP. So we're talking about a make work project, all part of C-71, which the independent senators decided to give a rubber stamp instead of putting a check and balance in place to say, okay, this doesn't make sense, this doesn't enhance or impact public safety, this is just liberal hackery. So these are a couple of the key issues here. Now these are not insignificant pieces of legislation. They're not. They're very relevant. They're very, very relevant for gun owners because these are bureaucratic. But the reason I think this is so important is because the Liberals are not interested in saying, this is what we think a gun ownership regime in Canada is supposed to look like. This is a very important point here. The Liberals don't have their vision of, you know, we don't like this Harper thing. You know, we want gun ownership to look like this. And whatever this is, they don't have that model. No, their interest is in rolling back access as much as they can politically until it's going to cost them, and then they stop. They're interested in gaining ground, not in actually creating a vision for this thing that in Canada. And not that I would agree with that vision, but at least we'd see the end point. And if the Liberals were in good faith saying, look, the licensing permit, that's all fine. We've got some issues with the classification system. Okay, maybe we disagree, but we have that discussion. Or if they say, well, the authorization to transport issue, this is a sticking point for us. No, they're actually trying to do as much as they can. And I have proof of this because when C-71 was passed, this was a broad bill. This was a very broad bill. They put a lot of things in it, and this was their massive gun reform package. And then what happened? The Danforth Avenue shooting. The Danforth Ave shooting happened after C-71 was introduced and already working its way through the parliamentary process. And the reason that's important is because C-71 would have done a gun ban if the Liberals had been interested in doing a gun ban. It would have restricted handguns if the Liberals were interested in restricting handguns. It would have done all of this if the Liberals wanted to and planned to do it. But it didn't until the Danforth Ave shooting gave the Liberals political cover. That was what happened. It gave them political cover so they could start putting all of these things in place that they've always wanted to but never had the political willpower to do. And this is why Canadian gun owners should be very concerned right now, because all bets are off. They're able to do pretty much anything they want because there's a backdrop of gun violence stories between what happened on Danforth and what happened in Christchurch. Again, apologies. And the Christchurch shooting, again, nothing to do with Canada, nothing to do with Canadian gun laws, nothing to do with a Canadian story. But Ralph Goodale says, point blank, that may factor into the decisions that are being made by the government in Canada. And I did a video, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, where I played a clip from Bill Blair talking with Evan Solomon on CTV. And Bill Blair said very candidly, he's not taking anything off the table, specifically in reference to whether he would use an order in council, which is a cabinet directive that does not go through Parliament, that is not voted on, whether he would use an order in council to ban certain types of firearms. We still know that the government is mulling a handgun ban, and there's also risk that government is going to do a ban on what's called the AR-15. Now, I want to talk about the AR-15 for a couple of moments here because it's one of the most misunderstood and I would say falsely maligned guns that exist in Canada. The reason I say this is tremendously significant here is because the AR-15, if I were to ask you, now don't chime in if you're a gun owner, but if I were to ask you as a non-gunner, what does the AR stand for? What does the AR stand for in AR-15? Most people think it means assault rifle. It doesn't. It means Armalite rifle, which is a type of, it's a manufacturing style. And the AR-15 is not one gun. It's a platform of gun. There are many different AR-15s that exist that are made by different manufacturers, from Colt to Smith & Wesson to Norenko. You can get an AR-15 style gun. And it's a very popular style of gun because they look cool, they're fun to shoot, they're lightweight, and they're very versatile. So people who are handy like them because they can upgrade them, you can swap out pieces, you can actually get your hands dirty by dismantling them and upgrading them and growing them. An AR-15 has the same rate of fire and the same round of ammunition that it fires as many non-restricted guns. Guns that do not require the special license that an AR-15 requires, like a Mini 14, for example. And you can actually make a Mini 14 look almost identical to an AR-15. They fire the same round of ammunition, the same distance. They're both just as concealable or non-concealable. One's non-restricted and one's restricted. And the reason this is relevant is because the AR-15 has become the focal point of gun grabbers for no reason other than it's been used in mass shootings. The reason it's used in mass shootings is not because it's a more violent gun than other types of guns. The reason it's been used in mass shootings is because it's popular. It would be no different than saying that Honda Civics are used in more car crashes than Maseratis. Well, because the Honda Civic's a more popular car, you're going to see it in more incidents just as a matter of statistics. But let me tell you, AR-15s right now in Canada are flying off of store shelves. AR-15s are flying off of shelves. Companies cannot keep them in stock because gun owners are terrified, and I would say justifiably so, that there's a change that's going to come and make these prohibited, meaning that you'll only be able to have one if you have it before the prohibition goes into effect. And by the way, I'm in this group of people that bought one last week just because I want to make sure that if this gets banned, I am able to keep it. It's a big gamble. A lot of Canadians are making this gamble because they don't trust Bill Blair to govern the firearms regime in Canada with actual sense. They do not trust the government, and nor should they. No one should trust the government right now because the government has been doing this in bad faith. And here's what I say why. I would not have supported an AR-15 ban or a handgun ban being put through the legislature as part of C-71. It's bad policy and it's bad politics. But I would have more respect for at least a process that goes through the parliamentary channels than the order in council that Bill Blair is mulling now. And this order in council serves no other purpose than to subvert the democratic process. Now, the good news is that if there's a change in government, something that can be done by cabinet by the stroke of a pen can also be undone by cabinet by the stroke of a pen. But there's a big if there. Number one, there needs to be a change in government. And though there is an election coming up in October, there's no guarantee the Conservatives will win. Andrew Scheer has said that he will, if elected Prime Minister, undo C-71. But the problem with AR-15s and handguns is that it's very difficult, given how much misinformation exists about these guns, to have a politician do anything about them. If just think of this. If Andrew Scheer were to be the Prime Minister right now and were to say, we're making it so that Canadians can go back to owning AR-15s, the media is going to hang on his shoulder everyone who's ever been killed by an AR-15. They're going to make him the perpetrator of the Sandy Hook shooting. This is exactly what's going to happen because the media does not understand or does not want to understand guns. You know, I once saw a news story. This is a completely minor point, but I feel the need to share it anyway. I saw a news story that was talking about a firearm seizure that had taken place, and someone was accused of, or the police were said to have taken from someone they arrested a bolt-action semi-automatic gun. Now, if you're a gun owner, you're scratching your head right now wondering what on earth a bolt-action semi-automatic gun is. If you're not a gun owner, you might not know that is impossible. Bolt-action is not semi-automatic. Semi-automatic is not bolt-action. Something cannot be both. But what had happened in this case is police had sent out a press release and they had made a mistake in what they called the firearm. And the person who wrote the story had no idea, because most people in media in Canada have never held a gun in their life, let alone owned one. So they just copy and paste it and assume that it's valid. And I would love to see a lot more literacy about firearms, because so many of the issues here, so many of the issues in Canadian understanding could be dealt with if Canadians had a bit more exposure to it. You've got two groups of people. You've got those who are malicious and hate guns and hate gun owners, and you also have the other side of this, which is people that genuinely have just never been around it before. And the Canadian Shooting Sports Association and the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights, now I'm a member of both organizations, so I want to disclose that, but both of them have done great work at actually inviting politicians out to the gun range. And some of them have taken them up on this offer. I don't know how many non-conservatives versus conservatives. I know conservatives right now are about the only allies that gun owners have, conservatives and the People's Party of Canada. But the conservatives have done a lot more on this historically, because when Stephen Harper was in power, the conservatives were being quite friendly to gun owners. So right now you have Bill Blair, who instead of facing voters and putting any gun laws in legislation, is waiting until the 11th hour potentially to put it in an order in council. Now, if the Liberals are hell-bent on eroding firearm owning rights and freedoms in Canada, the position that I've made is they have to go to the voters and say it in the election. And they have to get a mandate to do it. Now, that doesn't deal with my issues with such legislation, but at least it removes the lack of transparency component of it. And that, I think, is significant. Now, Jim writes Well, Jordan writes on Facebook, C-71 is a bad bill, period. I agree. Very much, Jordan. I'm of the same mind on that. Jim writes, Canadians don't know what it's like to have your rights taken away, but they will know this is the tip of the iceberg. I think that's an important point here, because I mentioned earlier in this stream that gun owners are a minority group in Canada statistically. It's not a tiny group. I mean, we're talking about millions of legally owned guns in Canada, but it still is a minority of the population that is impacted by changes to gun laws. And if people turn a blind eye because, oh, well, I'm not a gun owner, it's not my problem, you are giving government license to make other legislative changes or super legislative changes that impact you down the road because you didn't speak up now. And I'm not going to, torture that Martin Niemöller poem of first they came for and I didn't speak, because that's not about gun owners. That's about something far more significant. But there is something to that idea of you need to look out when government is undemocratically taking away someone else's rights, because it could just as easily be yours down the road once that becomes the standard and once that becomes the precedent. So I do think people need to pay attention there, and also look at the inventory issues right now. The fact that gun stores across Canada cannot keep certain handguns on the shelves, cannot keep AR-15s on the shelf, says that there is a contingent of gun owners in Canada, a sizable contingent, that is not prepared to take this lying down. So Bill Blair, whose job is to apparently take guns off the street, has actually done more to put guns into the civilian market than he's done to take them out of it, because Bill Blair's fear-mongering has caused people to, like the Charlton Heston thing, make sure that the government will only get them from their cold, dead hands. Because one of the other issues with C-71 is basically the Liberals trying to secretly bring back a gun registry. And the Long Gun Registry, one of the most colossally failed programs in Canadian history when it comes to policing and justice. It was the program that if you were to have a non-restricted gun like a hunting rifle or a shotgun or even a musket, you had to register it. It cost billions of dollars, did nothing for public safety. The Conservatives, thank goodness, got rid of it when Stephen Harper was in office. But the current infrastructure now, the Liberals keep saying we're not bringing back the gun registry, we're not bringing it back. But one of the things that C-71 does is makes it a requirement that gun stores log the serial number, make, model, license number, name, address of anyone who buys a non-restricted gun. So this means, now, by the way, a lot of gun stores do this for their own records, but now that government is compelling it, there is a record that government is aware of where every gun is going to be in Canada that is sold from the implementation date of this until this is repealed, which means that there is de facto a registry. Now, the only difference is it's not a centralized registry, but it means that government is going to, at a certain point, if a gun is used in a crime, try to subpoena this record, and boom, all of a sudden we've got a gun registry that is of access to the government and of use to the government. So these are why these issues are significant and why gun owners need to step up and do it. And look, I'm doing this because I believe in it and because it impacts me. But I'm trying to bridge this gap between gun owners who are aware of these issues and even non-gun owners. You may not personally have skin in the game, but we're talking about due process, we're talking about rights, and more importantly, we're talking about ineffectual, inept legislation that is being done under this guise of public safety, but actually has no public safety benefit. The only people impacted by these are those with a willingness to follow the law as it is. I don't want a criminal record. I don't want guns seized. I don't want to break the law. I am a law-abiding person. That's in my nature. That's in my DNA. So I'm going to follow all these rules begrudgingly, but I'll follow them. I will follow them. The criminals that are causing the gun issues in Canada, that are causing the gun homicides, that don't have legal guns, that don't have registered guns, that don't have licenses, they're not going to follow them. This is not rocket science. And I know I shouldn't be expecting rocket science from government right now, but the people that are impacted by this are the ones like me, not the ones that are actually committing the crimes. So Bill Blair is going to continue to try to push that boundary as much as he feels he can get away with politically, which is why we need to look to the government and defiantly and clearly say stop right now. And that's one of the things True North is doing. That's one of the things I'm doing. I will say we can't do this alone as a media outlet that is actually aware of firearms laws and promoting them from a perspective of law-abiding gun ownership. We do need your support. We are a grassroots organization. If you head on over to tnc.news and you can chip in a couple of dollars to our efforts, it's tax deductible. We very much appreciate it. And you can also join the Heritage Club, the Andrew Lawton Heritage Club specifically, for about $10 a month. You get some great bonuses and you can support the work that we're doing. So that's my pitch. Hope you all have a great rest of the week. Thank you for dealing with my raspiness, and thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week, Canada. Thank you. God bless and good day.